Alright, what's up YouTubers and boxing fans? The 17 Brandon coming at y'all with another Keeping It Real boxing show. I'm going to talk about Mikkel Kessler versus Andre Ward. My prediction on this fight. Mikkel Kessler, my boy, just been knocking heads off lately. Won his last fight by knockout. Andre Ward won his last fight by stoppage. So these guys are evenly matched. Both coming in 6'1", both of them 73-inch reach. Both of these guys are evenly matched. Mikkel Kessler, both of them are orthodox style fighters. So it should be a great fight. Hopefully no headbutts or nothing like that. This should be a kind of war fighter, aggressive, pressure fighter. Mikkel Kessler versus a tactician such as Andre Ward. People compare Andre Ward more to Roy Jones Jr. I don't even really think we can compare the two. Andre Ward does have good reflexes, but other than that, he seems more like a defensive type fighter, technical fighter. Doesn't seem too much like a Roy Jones Jr. Roy Jones Jr. was more flashy. Roy Jones Jr., his athleticism just carried him along his whole career. But Andre Ward, he got athleticism, but it's not like Roy Jones Jr. Andre Ward, he can fight with athleticism if he wants, but he chooses to fight technically, such as a Bernard Hopkins or someone like that. He's not too much of a Roy Jones at all. So, how do I think this fight will play out? I think this is going to be a war. Mikkel Kessler's going to come in. Mikkel Kessler is not a long distance fighter. He can fight long distance, but most of his fights end in TKO. He never had to really fight the distance except against Kawasaki, and he lost that fight. Looking back at that fight, Kawasaki versus Mikkel Kessler. Mikkel Kessler came in and was given one heck of a fight. Kawasaki, more experienced, all around better fighter. Kawasaki was giving Mikkel Kessler problems midway through that fight. Kessler was winning all the early rounds in my opinion. But you seen Kawasaki really coming in around the 5th round, end of the 4th, maybe the 5th round I have to say, and really start getting to Mikkel Kessler. Mikkel Kessler wasn't able to land his right. Mikkel Kessler was really trying to push his on that fight. He was catching Kawasaki, and Kawasaki was just tough enough to stay up. Kawasaki uses great foot movement, used his head movement, and Mikkel Kessler wasn't always able to land flush on Kawasaki. And Kawasaki's footwork gave Kessler more problems than everything else. Because if you see Kessler fights orthodox stand-up position like this. Keep both hands up. He fights properly. He's a proper boxer with excellent power. But he doesn't use foot movement. He waits there. He waits there for you to make the wrong move. He waits for you to open up so he can land that right or even land his left, which is even powerful. But his left is more of his setup punch. You know what I mean? It's his jab. And once he sets you up and he catches you at the right moment, trust me, he has I believe a 70-80% chance of knocking you out. So Mikkel Kessler is going to be a tough fight for Andre Ward. And the whole thing for Mikkel Kessler is, can he land that flush right on Andre Ward? And if he can hurt Andre Ward. And I don't think he's going to be able to outbox Andre Ward. I have to say Andre Ward is the better, more rounded boxer in this fight. I won't say better. I will say he's more rounded, skill-wise. Both of these guys, either of these guys can win this fight. Mikkel Kessler is most likely going to have to try to win this fight. He's going to have to try to get Andre Ward out there, in my opinion. He's going to have to try to knock Andre Ward out. I won't say go in there and try to knock his head off, because when most fighters do that, they get themselves in trouble. So what Mikkel Kessler needs to do is go in there and just take advantage of every opportunity he gets. Every opportunity he gets. When Andre Ward goes up against the ropes, sometimes something else Andre Ward does is he tends to turn his head sometimes. If you look back at the Edison Miranda fight, which Andre Ward did excellent in that fight and put a beat down on Edison Miranda. But I noticed something he did a few times in that fight, and that was when he was dipping down and dipping away from punches. Sometimes he had a tendency to turn his head completely. I didn't see him do that in his last fight, so he maybe corrected that. But if you look at that fight, you're going to see him turn his head sometimes like that. And from what I've been taught when I used to box when I was 15, is you never want to turn your head in anything. So Andre Ward don't want to turn his head against somebody like Mikkel Kessler who can knock you out, especially if it's a punch you don't see. Now, I think that's as far as where people compare Andre Ward to Roy Jones Jr. because Roy Jones Jr. did similar stuff. Roy Jones Jr. would throw a punch while dipping back, and that got him in trouble later on in his career against Antonio Tarver. But I have to say Andre Ward is a better technical fighter than Roy Jones Jr. Not a more skillful fighter than Roy Jones, but technically he's better than Roy Jones with his defense. So what Andre Ward is going to need to do is outbox Mikkel Kessler. Go for the decision. If a knockout comes, a knockout comes. If you see him hurt mid later on during the fight, still be pretty cautious because Mikkel Kessler is one of those type of fighters. Even when you have him hurt, he can still knock you out. And Andre Ward got to watch out fighting somebody like Mikkel Kessler. And I'm pretty sure he's aware of Mikkel Kessler's power punch. So what Andre Ward is going to need to do, like I said, is outbox him. He's going to have to use his head movement. He's going to pretty much have to do what Kawasaki did. Even though Kawasaki and Andre Ward are different style type fighters, they're both technical fighters. Even Kawasaki was a technical fighter. He tended to get hit a lot, but he some way he found his way to avoid, getting hit too much. That was due to his foot movement and his unorthodox type style. In this case, Andre Ward is an unorthodox type of fighter. He's a basic orthodox type of fighter. So, in my prediction, I'm going to have to go with Andre Ward. I'm going to have to go with the more round, better technical fighter, and that's Andre Ward. I don't see Andre Ward taking too many risks. I see him pretty much keeping the fight on the outside. Andre Ward is a great inside fighter. And Mikkel Kessler, you can smother Mikkel Kessler, but I see him keeping this fight on the outside and in the middle of the ring where he can beat Kessler to the punch. And like I said, what Kessler's going to have to try to do is he's going to have to try to pick his spots, can't be too picky. And I also think he should try to pressure Ward a little bit. Put a little bit of pressure on him. Don't get careless putting pressure on him now, because Kessler can find himself in trouble. Ward does have a little bit of pop behind his punch. So Kessler's going to have to go in there and apply a little bit of pressure, try to get him up against the ropes, and don't try to keep this fight in the center of the ring where he can be outboxed. Andre Ward, I think, is going to be able to establish his jab from the first round to the 12th. He's going to be able to use his defensive abilities, his head movement, his foot movement. Expect him to outbox Mikkel Kessler to keep Kessler in the center in the ring, and expect it to go to a 12-round decision. Expect Kessler to catch Andre Ward a couple times and possibly even see Andre Ward stunned a couple times but not hurt. So I have to go with Andre Ward by a unanimous decision. Thank you for checking out my show, and I'm going to have more predictions to come. Peace.